Story 1. I glanced at my phone, hoping to check the time, but instead, I was met with something far more unnerving. No matter what I did, it kept resetting itself back to 3:17 a.m. At first, I brushed it off as a glitch, a simple app malfunction or perhaps a software update gone wrong. But as I stared at the screen, something felt off. The time, 3:17 a.m., was stuck. No matter how many times I swiped away the clock app, opened other apps, or tried to restart it, the moment I returned to the home screen, there it was again, mocking me, 3:17 a.m. Frustrated, I powered the phone off, hoping it would reset, but when it powered back on, the time remained stubbornly the same. I tried everything, adjusting the settings, switching time zones, even setting the time manually, but it didn't matter. The moment I touched the clock, it snapped right back to that exact time, as though it were daring me to change it. The unease in my chest grew. I had been awake for hours, unable to sleep, and now this strange, persistent malfunction was adding to my growing anxiety. I checked the date on my phone, but it offered no clues. It still showed the same day, while the time remained locked in place, frozen. I turned the phone over in my hands, half expecting it to somehow be alive, to be haunted by something. It felt like I was trapped in some kind of loop, and the thought made my stomach churn. I glanced at the wall clock. 3:21 a.m. For a brief moment, I thought I might be imagining things, but when I looked back at my phone, the time hadn't budged. It was as if the phone had refused to acknowledge the passage of time. A cold shiver crept down my spine. This wasn't right. This wasn't normal. I placed the phone on the table, trying to distract myself with other things, books, music, even the TV, but my mind kept returning to the screen. That relentless 3:17 a.m. It wasn't just a malfunction anymore. It felt like something was watching me. I picked up the phone again, half expecting it to change on its own. But no, there it was again, 3:17 a.m., mocking me. The silence outside my apartment was suffocating, as if the world itself had stopped moving, frozen in time. The phone had trapped me in a moment that refused to move forward. Hours passed, or at least, I thought they did. I checked the time again, still 3:17 a.m. Nothing I did would make it change. I even tried putting the phone in airplane mode, hoping that disconnecting it from the network would somehow reset it. But nothing worked. The phone remained locked in its strange, unyielding moment. I began to feel like it wasn't just the phone that was trapped. It was me. Time itself had stopped, and I was helpless to break free. I thought about calling someone who might be able to help, but what could I even say? My phone stuck on 3:17 a.m. It sounded ridiculous, even to my own ears. Yet, the time on the phone continued to mock me, unchanging. I put the phone down again, trying to calm myself. Maybe I was just overworked. Maybe I was hallucinating. But deep down, I knew something was happening, something beyond my understanding. I looked at the phone again, half expecting it to have changed, but it hadn't. Still 3:17 a.m. A wave of panic hit me, sharp and cold. It wasn't just the phone now. The air around me had changed. It was thick, like I was holding my breath, waiting for something. I stood up, pacing the apartment, hoping that walking around would help me escape this feeling of being trapped. But no matter where I went, no matter how far I walked, I felt as though I were stuck in the same moment, circling back to where I started. I checked the phone again. This time, something was different. The screen flickered, briefly showing a series of numbers before snapping back to 3:17 a.m. I couldn't make sense of it, but it was enough to send a chill through me. It was as if the phone was trying to communicate something I couldn't quite understand. A part of me felt on the edge of discovering something, but I couldn't reach it. The minutes dragged on, stretched thin by the stillness of the room. I kept staring at the phone, waiting for the time to change, but it never did. It was as if the room itself was fading in and out of focus. The clock on the wall read 3:21 a.m., but it didn't feel right. Something about it felt off, out of sync with the rest of the world. Finally, I stood up and walked to the window, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. But when I looked outside, my blood ran cold. The streets were empty. No cars. No people. It was as if the world itself had frozen in place. The phone buzzed in my hand, breaking the eerie silence. I checked it one last time. The time had changed, only by a minute, but it was moving forward. 3:18 a.m. For the first time in hours, it seemed like time was beginning to move again. But something told me, it wasn't over. Story 2. I had been driving for hours, the road ahead stretching into nothingness, as I ventured deeper into the quiet countryside. The sun had started its slow descent behind the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange, but my stomach grumbled, a reminder that it had been far too long since I last ate. Just as the gnawing hunger became unbearable, I spotted a small gas station up ahead. It looked like the only one for miles, so I pulled over, eager to stretch my legs and grab something quick. The station was oddly small, and the flickering overhead lights cast an eerie glow on the rows of pumps. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and rubber, but it was the silence that unsettled me. It felt out of place for a highway stop, like I had stumbled upon a forgotten corner of the world. As I stepped out of my car, I noticed only a few vehicles parked nearby, but their drivers were nowhere to be seen. The cashier behind the counter gave me a half-hearted wave, his eyes disinterested. I grabbed a snack, paid quickly, and rushed back to my car, eager to get back on the road. But as I approached the driver's side, an unsettling sensation crept up my spine. Someone was watching me. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just the exhaustion from the long drive. I opened the door and slid into the seat, glancing around once more. Everything seemed normal, the stillness of the night settling over the empty lot. As I shut the car door, the echo rang louder than it should have, amplifying the silence. That's when I saw it, a small folded note sitting on the passenger seat. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at it, unsure of what to do. I hadn't seen anyone near my car when I walked back, and yet, there it was, as if it had been waiting for me. The handwriting was messy, hurried, as though the writer had been in a rush. With trembling fingers, I unfolded it, and my eyes locked on the words, "I'm watching you." A cold chill ran down my spine as the reality of the message set in. It wasn't just a note, it was a threat. My mind raced with questions. Who had left this? Why me? I looked around the empty gas station again, but the parking lot remained desolate. The cashier had disappeared from view, and the only sounds were the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of trucks on the highway. At first, I tried to laugh it off as some prank, a bored soul's idea of a joke, but the message felt too personal, too direct. It felt like a warning, not something to laugh about. My eyes darted over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone lurking behind me, but the back seat was empty. My heart raced. I quickly shoved the note into the glove compartment, locking it away as though that could somehow make me feel safe. I started the car, my hands slick with sweat on the steering wheel. The road ahead should have felt peaceful, but my mind kept spiraling. What if someone had been watching me for miles? What if they were following me, waiting for the right moment to leave that note? Every car I passed made me uneasy. Was someone in those vehicles watching me too? Had they left the note? As I neared a small town, I spotted a motel with a flickering neon sign. I hadn't planned on stopping, but the thought of continuing down the road any longer felt unbearable. I needed a break, some distance from the creeping paranoia gnawing at my mind. I pulled into the parking lot, the headlights casting long shadows across the pavement. The motel was eerily quiet, too quiet. I grabbed my bag, my footsteps echoing across the lot, the silence pressing in from all sides. Inside the office, the clerk barely looked up when I asked for a room. His face was expressionless, a blank mask of indifference. I paid for the night, took my key, and practically ran to my room. I double-checked the locks, pulled the curtains tight, and sat down on the bed. The room was small, nothing special, but it felt like a sanctuary compared to the road. Yet, even as I sat there, trying to calm my racing heart, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong. The note, the words, haunted me. Who had left it? Had they followed me here? I turned on the TV in a desperate attempt to distract myself, but every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the window, made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As the night wore on, I lay awake, staring at the door, the windows, the dark corners of the room. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift, and I couldn't rid myself of the feeling of being watched. The words on that note echoed in my mind, taunting me, "I'm watching you." It was a promise, not a threat, and it was clear that no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, someone was always watching. Story 3. I woke up one morning, the pale light from my computer screen casting an eerie glow over the room. I had gone to bed late the night before, utterly exhausted from a long day at work, and in my haze, I hadn't bothered to turn off my computer. As I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the lingering fatigue, I noticed something odd. The screen was still on, and there, staring back at me, was a file I didn't recognize. I didn't open it, and I certainly didn't remember creating it. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I leaned in closer to inspect it. The file was labeled with a random jumble of numbers and letters. I hesitated for a moment, dread creeping up my spine, before my trembling fingers clicked the file open. As the document loaded, my heart skipped a beat. A series of photos appeared, each one more disturbing than the last. The first photo was of me standing in my kitchen, a cup of coffee in hand, yet I had no memory of anyone being there. I had no recollection of this moment at all. The photo was crystal clear, as if taken just moments ago. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I scrolled through the next photos, each one more unsettling than the previous. There was one of me walking down the street near my apartment, taken from a distance, like someone had been stalking me. Another showed me sitting on my couch, absorbed in my phone, with the photo clearly taken through the window. The more I looked, the more the sense of violation sank in. Who had been watching me? How had they gotten these photos? I continued clicking through, my stomach twisting as the photos seemed to chronicle my life, mundane, innocent moments I hadn't thought twice about. Yet now, seeing them from the perspective of a hidden observer, I felt a deep sense of horror. Some of the photos were taken at night, when I was sure I was alone. One showed me leaving work late, walking to my car in the dark, with a shadowy figure trailing far behind me, barely visible. Another was of me sipping coffee at a cafe, unaware that I was being photographed through the window. The photos weren't random. They were deliberate, carefully composed, as if someone had been following me for days. The weight of realization crashed down on me. Who had taken these photos? How had they gotten onto my computer? I opened the computer's history, searching for any clue, but everything seemed normal. There were no unfamiliar programs, no signs of tampering. It was as though the photos had simply materialized out of thin air. Panic set in, my breath quickening as the gravity of the situation sank in. The thought of someone having access to my most private moments made me feel sick. I quickly shut down my computer, hoping that would stop whatever was happening. But the unease didn't vanish. It only deepened. Hours passed, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My mind raced. Who could do something like this? I had no enemies, no one who would want to harm me. I was careful with my privacy, careful not to overshare online. But now, I realized just how vulnerable I had been. I checked my phone and social media accounts, hoping to find some clue, some sign of a breach. But there was nothing. No strange messages, no hacking attempts. Yet the unease gnawed at me. The next day, I took action. I changed all my passwords and ran a full security scan on my computer. But no threats were found. The system was clean. I tried to reassure myself, telling myself it was just some glitch, a weird coincidence. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was no rational explanation for how those photos had ended up on my computer. That night, sleep eluded me. My mind spun with the possibilities. What if the person who had taken those photos was still out there, watching me? What if they were waiting for the right moment to do something else? The thought filled me with a restless paranoia. I kept my phone close, checking it every few minutes, half expecting another strange message or another set of photos to appear. But nothing came. The silence was worse than anything. The next morning, I told a few close friends. They were as shocked as I was, but they offered no answers. Desperate, I went to the police, showing them the photos. But they were skeptical. Without concrete evidence, they couldn't do anything. They advised me to stay alert, to report any further strange activity. Weeks passed. The photos didn't return. No more strange occurrences. But the fear lingered. Every time I opened my computer, I felt a knot in my stomach, half expecting another file to pop up. And whenever I walked down the street or sat in a cafe, I couldn't help but wonder, was someone still watching me? Story 4. It was just another regular afternoon when I first realized something was wrong. I had just come home from the grocery store, bags clinking with their contents as I unloaded them onto the kitchen counter. Reaching into my purse to grab my wallet, my heart stopped. It wasn't there. Panic gripped me immediately. I scrambled through every compartment, my hands trembling, but it was as if it had vanished into thin air. I had clearly remembered putting it in my purse before leaving the house, so where was it now? I retraced my steps in my mind, recalling the morning, paying for my groceries, fumbling with change at the register. After that, I hadn't used my wallet again. I dashed to my car, hoping it had somehow been left there, but after checking every corner, glove compartment, between the seats, I was met with nothing. The unease deepened. My pulse quickened as I called the grocery store, praying someone had turned it in, but the response was empty. It was as if the wallet had never existed. Desperate, I went through my purse again, hoping to find some clue, some sign of where it could have gone. I dumped everything out onto the kitchen table, lip balm, crumpled receipts, old tissues, and then, something strange. At the very bottom, tucked in the corner, was a wallet, but not mine. It was black leather, worn at the edges, and completely unfamiliar. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Opening it, I found several cards, an ID, and a few business cards. My fingers froze when I pulled out the ID, Eleanor Hayes. I had never heard that name before. The moment I saw it, a creeping sense of dread settled over me. I flipped through the wallet, but none of it looked familiar. It felt wrong. How could someone else's wallet end up in my purse? A mix-up didn't seem likely, it felt deliberate, calculated. I sat at the table, the weight of the wallet heavy in my hands. How had it gotten there? I hadn't seen anyone near my purse recently. The grocery store was quiet, no one was close. I checked my purse again, convinced it was a mistake, but the wallet remained, mocking me with its eerie presence. I felt a chill creep over me, someone had placed it there on purpose. I considered calling the police, but what could I say? I had no proof, just a stranger's wallet in my possession. But the more I thought about it, the more my skin crawled. What if I was being watched? What if this was part of something far darker than I could understand? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was tangled in something sinister. The name on the ID didn't turn up much when I searched online, but one result caught my eye, a missing persons report from a nearby town. Eleanor Hayes had been reported missing weeks ago under mysterious circumstances. My stomach dropped as I read the details. She had been last seen leaving a coffee shop. No leads, no clues. Could this be the same woman? Her wallet somehow ending up in my purse. The thought made my blood run cold. What were the chances? I felt like I was being pulled into something that I couldn't escape, like I had stumbled into a nightmare I wasn't prepared for. I decided to call the police, hesitating only for a moment before dialing. The officer who answered sounded concerned. He asked for the details of the wallet and how it had ended up in my possession. He assured me that someone would come to take it and investigate further. When the officers arrived, I felt a strange sense of relief, but the questions didn't go away. How had the wallet ended up in my purse? What did it mean? The officers asked a few more questions, took the wallet, and left. I watched them go, but the unease remained. Days passed, and I tried to move on, but Eleanor Hayes's face kept lingering in my mind. I checked the news daily, hoping for an update, but there was nothing. She had vanished, just like her wallet had mysteriously appeared in my possession. The more I thought about it, the more I felt like I had been dragged into something far bigger, something dark and incomprehensible. Whoever had placed that wallet in my purse had a purpose, and I had a sinking feeling that this wasn't over. I hadn't seen the last of Eleanor Hayes, or whatever shadows had followed her. Story 5. I woke with a start, my eyes snapping open to the oppressive blackness of the room around me. The air felt unnaturally still, thick with an unsettling weight, as though something in the darkness was watching, waiting. My heart pounded as I reached for my phone on the nightstand, squinting at the glowing screen. 3:33 a.m. The numbers gleamed in the dark, casting an eerie, almost ominous light across the room. I rolled over, trying to shake the creeping sense of dread and fall back into sleep, but the moment felt frozen in time, suspended between worlds. Something about the time on the screen felt wrong. With a shiver, I instinctively swiped to unlock the phone, and that's when I saw it, the message that made my blood run cold. At exactly 3:32 a.m., just 1 second before I had checked the time, my phone had received a text. But I hadn't heard a notification. I hadn't seen it come through. I froze, my thumb hovering over the message. I shouldn't open it, I thought. Maybe it was just a glitch or some mistake. But something inside me, a dark, instinctual pull, urged me to unlock it. I had to know. The text was short, but it felt like it pierced through the silence of the room. I'm watching you. I froze, the chill that ran down my spine far colder than the air around me. I sat up, my body now fully awake, my mind racing. I could feel the weight of the message, each word sinking deeper into my chest. I checked the time again. 3:33 a.m. The seconds felt like hours, stretching, twisting. I stared at the message, struggling to rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank, maybe just some random wrong number. But the timing was too precise, too unnerving. How could anyone know the exact second I had checked my phone? My heart thundered in my chest as I glanced nervously around the room. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind outside, made my pulse quicken. It felt like I wasn't alone, like someone, something, was out there, watching me. I opened my text messages to see if there were any other strange notifications. There was nothing. Only the unread message, no strange numbers, no unsaved contacts. It didn't add up. I considered calling a friend, anyone, just to hear a familiar voice, but the thought of speaking into the darkness made the air grow even colder. Instead, I sat in the silence, eyes flicking between the phone and the shadows in the corners of the room. I checked the locks on the windows and doors, though I knew I had done it just hours before. Everything seemed normal, too normal. But that message kept echoing in my mind, I'm watching you. I grabbed the phone again, hands shaking, scrolling through the message history. The number was unfamiliar. An area code I didn't recognize. No other information available. I could feel the panic creeping in, the fear tightening around my chest. What was this? I tried calling the number, hoping for some answer that would make sense of the madness. The phone rang. and rang. Then, silence. I tried again, but this time the call didn't even connect. The line was dead. I stared at the phone, the cold light from the screen illuminating my face. The silence in the room felt suffocating, pressing in from all sides. It was as though the world outside had ceased to exist, leaving me in this strange, empty bubble of fear. I didn't sleep that night. Hours passed as I stared at the screen, replaying the message, replaying the moment in my mind. But no matter how many times I checked the time, no matter how many times I stared at that cryptic text, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The world around me seemed different. More dangerous. As if I was no longer alone in it. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the darkness, the message was gone, vanished as if it had never been there. But the fear didn't fade. It lingered in the corners of the room, hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. And though the day continued as normal, I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that someone was still watching me. Waiting. Biding their time until the moment was right to make their presence known again. Story 6. I had been eagerly anticipating my solo camping trip for weeks. The idea of disconnecting from the world, immersing myself in the peaceful solitude of the woods, sounded like the perfect escape. I packed my gear, threw everything into my car, and drove to a remote campsite I had found on an old hiking map. It was supposed to be a quiet retreat, just me, nature, and the stars. The first night was everything I had imagined. I set up my tent in a small clearing, surrounded by towering trees, the soft rustling of the wind whispering through the leaves. The cool air and clear sky offered a brilliant view of the stars above. I made a small fire, cooked dinner, and settled into my tent, lulled by the comforting sounds of the forest. Soon, the crackling fire faded into the background, and I drifted off to sleep, wrapped in the night's embrace. But when I woke up, something was horribly wrong. The usual sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling had vanished. In their place, an eerie silence hung thick in the air, pressing down on me. I blinked several times, trying to adjust to the dim light filtering through the fabric of my tent. Something wasn't right. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the lingering fog of sleep, and reached for the zipper to open the tent, only to freeze in place. The zipper was undone. I had been sure I'd closed it tightly before drifting off, yet now it was partially open. I hesitated, a rush of unease flooding my veins. Maybe I'd forgotten, I thought. Maybe I had left it open in my tired state. But as I pushed the flap aside, my heart skipped a beat. The campsite was a mess. My backpack, which I'd left just outside the tent, was gone. My sleeping bag lay discarded on the ground, and my cooking supplies were scattered across the area, as if someone had rifled through them. Panic surged through me as I scrambled out of the tent, my eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of what had happened. The fire pit was cold, the ashes scattered and untouched. My belongings, water bottle, flashlight, even my extra clothes, were gone, and there were no signs of a struggle. No broken branches, no footprints leading away. It was as if someone had come in, taken everything, and vanished without a trace. I tried to calm myself. Maybe another camper had passed through and decided to borrow my things. But as I looked around again, something didn't add up. The tent had been opened from the outside, meaning whoever had taken my belongings had been able to access it while I was asleep. How could I have slept through it? How could they have gotten so close without making a sound? I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. This wasn't a simple case of someone walking by and snatching a few items, it felt deliberate, calculated. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were doing. I scanned the forest, hoping to see something that would explain it, but the woods were as still and silent as they had been when I arrived. With my nerves on edge, I decided to pack up and leave. The thought of staying in that spot any longer made my skin crawl. As I shoved what little I had left into my bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking just out of sight. But the woods remained as empty and silent as before. Once everything was packed, I rushed back to my car. The drive home was long and tense, my mind replaying every moment of the morning. What had happened? Who had taken my things, and why? The more I thought about it, the more questions I had, and the less I understood. It didn't make sense. If it had been another camper, why hadn't they left any trace? Why hadn't I heard anything? I stopped at a gas station on the way home, my hands still shaking as I refueled my car. The attendant gave me a curious look, but I didn't feel like talking. I just wanted to get home and forget the whole trip. When I finally arrived back at my apartment, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a strange, unsettling coincidence. Maybe I hadn't secured the tent properly, or maybe I'd been too tired to notice anything. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Someone had been there. Someone had taken my things. And whoever they were still out there. I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't just been the victim of some random theft. No, it felt personal. I felt targeted. The thought of someone watching me while I slept made my skin crawl. I tried to rationalize it, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the empty campsite, the open tent, and I couldn't help but wonder who had been there, and what they wanted. Story 7. I had been at Sarah's house for hours, catching up on life and enjoying the comforting ambience of her cozy home. The air was filled with the soft flicker of candles, and the distant hum of background music set a tranquil mood. We were lounging in her living room, reminiscing about old times when I decided to step into the kitchen for a drink. Sarah was in the bathroom, leaving me alone in the room. For some reason, that quiet stillness felt unnerving, like something wasn't right. As I walked back to the living room, my eyes drifted to the large mirror mounted on the wall beside the couch. At first, I didn't think much of it. But then I noticed something strange in the reflection. There, in the mirrored room, stood a figure, tall, cloaked in a dark coat, just behind me, out of sight. My heart stopped. I froze, staring at the mirror in disbelief, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure stood motionless, its gaze seemingly locked onto me. I whipped around, but the room was empty. Nothing. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned every corner of the room, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But the figure, solid, present, was still there, in the reflection, standing unnervingly still. I stepped closer to the mirror, my pulse pounding in my ears. No one stood behind me. Nothing but the empty room. The reflection, however, remained. It was as though the mirror had trapped the figure there, an undeniable presence that I couldn't shake. My mind screamed to dismiss it as a trick of the light or a shadow cast from outside, but deep down, I knew something was off. When Sarah returned, I tried to act like nothing was wrong, but my nerves were fraying. I glanced at the mirror again, but it was only the empty room staring back at me. I thought I was overreacting, maybe just paranoid, but I couldn't ignore the haunting image of that figure. The reflection stayed with me, lurking in the back of my mind, even as we settled down to watch a movie. Every time the camera in the film moved across a reflective surface, my gaze involuntarily flicked to the mirror, expecting to see the figure again. But there was nothing. As the night wore on, a feeling of dread settled in. The sense that I wasn't alone in the room, that something was watching me from just beyond my vision, became almost overwhelming. Each time I glanced at the mirror, I thought I saw fleeting movements, just out of focus. The figure, if it was even real, was playing tricks on me, pulling me into its sinister game. When Sarah went to the kitchen to grab snacks, I couldn't resist. I had to know if the figure was still there. I approached the mirror again, my heart racing. This time, the figure was closer. Much closer. My stomach dropped. I spun around, but the room was still empty. I couldn't understand it. The figure was there, its shadowy form lingering just behind me, but there was no one in the room. When Sarah returned, she noticed my unease. She asked if I was okay, but how could I explain what had happened? How could I tell her that someone, was standing just behind me in the reflection, but nowhere to be found in the room? I smiled weakly, pretending everything was fine, but I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in my gut that something was horribly wrong. As the night stretched on, the figure in the mirror seemed to grow bolder. It was as though it was waiting for me to acknowledge it fully. Each time I glanced, its form was clearer, more defined. It felt like it was trying to reach out, to make its presence known. I couldn't stand it anymore. My nerves were shattered. I abruptly stood up and told Sarah I wasn't feeling well, that I needed to go home. She looked concerned, but didn't press me for details. I grabbed my things and rushed toward the door, my skin clammy with cold sweat. As I left her house, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still there, watching me from behind, following me. The drive home was a blur, my mind racing. Had it been a trick of the light? A figment of my imagination? Or had I really seen something? The unease in my chest only grew the more I thought about it. The figure in the reflection hadn't been a hallucination. It was too real, too vivid, and I couldn't help but wonder, had it followed me? Was it still lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself again? That night, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure standing behind me, its presence looming in the darkness. I tried to tell myself it was just a bad dream, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. It had been real. And I wasn't sure what it wanted. All I knew was that I hadn't seen the last of it. Story 8. It was late, one of those nights when the world outside felt suspended in stillness. The kind of quiet that seemed almost unnatural. I had been lying awake in bed for hours, my thoughts swirling around the events of the day, unable to find rest. The room was dark, save for the faint, flickering glow of a streetlight outside, casting long shadows across the walls. I rolled over, hoping to find a more comfortable position, when it came. A soft whisper. It was so faint, I thought I had imagined it at first. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the usual creaks and groans of an old house. But then, it came again, clearer this time. A voice, low and soft, right beside my ear. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and my heart began to race. I opened my eyes, expecting to find someone standing beside my bed, but there was no one there. I sat up, breath caught in my throat, my mind trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. Maybe it had been a dream, I thought, but the voice had been too real, too close, as if someone were standing inches away from me. I glanced around the room, half expecting to see a figure lurking in the shadows, but the room was empty, still, and as it should be. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was nothing more than my imagination playing tricks. Perhaps the stress of the day had caught up with me, and my mind was simply reacting to the unnatural quiet of the night. But the whispering wouldn't stop. I pulled the covers up around me, hoping sleep would come, but every little sound seemed amplified, the faint rustling of the wind, the ticking of the clock, the rhythmic pulse of my own breath. And then, the whispering returned. This time, it was louder, more insistent. The voice sounded almost familiar, but I couldn't place it. It called my name, but in a way that sent a chill creeping down my spine. I sat up again, my heart pounding. The room was still empty, the shadows in the corners undisturbed, the streetlight casting its unfeeling glow outside. The whispering stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving an eerie silence behind. I tried to reassure myself it was nothing, just a figment of my imagination. But the more I thought about it, the more the unease gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That something, or someone, was in the room with me. I had always prided myself on being a rational person, never one to believe in ghosts or the supernatural. But this felt different. This felt real. The hours passed slowly, and eventually, I fell into a fitful sleep. But even then, the feeling of being watched lingered. I would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I heard footsteps outside my door, only to find nothing there. The whispering had stopped, but the unease remained, a heavy weight pressing down on my chest, as though the house itself were holding its breath. The next day, I tried to shake off the strange events of the night before, convincing myself that it was all a result of stress and exhaustion. But the sense of unease never fully left me. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. But there was never anyone there. That night, I tried to go to bed early, hoping to get a good night's sleep. But as I lay there in the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The silence in the room was oppressive, and every little sound seemed magnified. I closed my eyes, willing myself to relax, but then, it happened again. The whisper. It was softer this time, but still as clear. My name, like a breath, cool and close, brushing against my ear. I snapped my eyes open, my body frozen in fear. The room was still empty. My pulse raced, my breath shallow. I tried to sit up, but my limbs felt heavy, like I was trapped in my own body. The whispering continued, soft, persistent, just beyond my hearing. It wasn't loud, but it was there. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was just my imagination. But the voice felt so real, so tangible, that I couldn't dismiss it. I was no longer sure what was real and what wasn't. Was I losing my mind? Or was there something, or someone, really here with me? The whispering grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just my name anymore. The voice was saying something else, something I couldn't quite make out. The words were garbled, like someone speaking through a wall. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I fumbled for the flashlight. It flickered weakly before illuminating the room, casting shadows across the corners. I scanned the space quickly. There was no one there. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, everything was as it should be. But the voice, it continued, like a distant echo. It seemed to come from everywhere, nowhere, all at once. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. In a panic, I leapt out of bed and ran to the door, flinging it open. The hallway was dark, but empty. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just the stress, the exhaustion. Maybe it was all in my head. But as I turned to head back to my room, I heard it again, the whisper. Faint, but unmistakable. It was too close. I turned, but still, no one was there. And in that moment, I realized, the whispers weren't coming from the room at all. They were coming from inside my mind. Story 9. The attic was always the last place I'd venture when cleaning the house. It was a maze of cluttered boxes, old furniture, and forgotten relics, all coated with layers of dust that seemed to grow thicker with each passing year. The air up there was stale, the kind of musty scent that clung to your skin, carrying with it the weight of forgotten memories. I had been avoiding the task for months, but today, for reasons I couldn't quite understand, I decided to confront it. I reached up to pull down an old box from the highest shelf. Its surface was blanketed with dust, unmarked, without a label or any indication of its contents. My curiosity got the better of me as I set it down carefully on the floor and pried it open. Inside, there were old newspapers, yellowing letters, and a collection of photographs, each one stacked neatly, yet all bearing a haunting weight. The photos were faded and brittle with age, their black and white tones softened by time. People I didn't recognize stared back at me from the images, old, weathered faces frozen in moments I couldn't recall. Some were groups, others solitary figures, standing in front of crumbling buildings or amidst wild landscapes. The clothing was from another era, decades past. I flipped through them, my fingers trembling, trying to place their faces, but none of them seemed familiar. Then, near the end of the stack, one photograph caught my eye. A group of people stood together, smiling in front of an old house. A woman on the left, a man with a child in the center, a few others scattered across the frame. But what truly struck me was the figure on the far right. It was me. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, convinced I was seeing things. But when I looked again, there I was, standing in the photo, much younger than I was now. The house in the background wasn't one I recognized, and neither were the people. The clothes I was wearing were unfamiliar. I racked my brain, trying to recall any moment, any memory of being in that place. But there was nothing. A cold wave of unease washed over me. How could this be? I had no recollection of this moment, this photo, this life. My heart pounded as I flipped the photo over, hoping for a date or a clue. But the back was blank. No names, no details, just the faint, haunting image of me among strangers, in a place that felt like a distant dream. I turned to the other photos, hands trembling. There was something odd about them, too. Some seemed to be taken in the same location, with the same people, yet none of their faces were familiar. And then, the strangest feeling crept up my spine, a sensation that I belonged in these moments, despite the fact that I couldn't remember any of them. I sat down in the attic, the warmth of the room closing in on me. The photo seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't explain. The people in it appeared happy, but their smiles were strained, almost forced. As though they were posing for something more sinister than just a family picture. The house behind them, old and dilapidated, was also unfamiliar. I stood, pacing the attic, my thoughts spinning in a whirlwind. Could the photo have been taken before I was born? No, if that were the case, I couldn't be in it. But if it wasn't from the past, then why did it feel so familiar? Why did I feel like I belonged there, with those people, in that place? Determined to find answers, I decided to take the photo downstairs and show it to my family. Maybe they would recognize something, anything, that could explain it. As I descended the stairs, I noticed something odd, a small scrap of paper wedged between the floorboards near the attic door. My heart skipped. I knelt down, a sense of urgency gnawing at me. The paper was blank, save for a single sentence written in faded ink: "You don't remember, but you were always meant to be here." My breath caught. What did it mean? Was this connected to the photo? To the memory I couldn't find? I folded the paper, tucking it into my pocket before heading downstairs. When I showed the photo to my family, they were just as confused as I was. They didn't recognize me or the people in the photo. And the house? No one had ever seen it before. The more I asked, the more it felt like I was unraveling a mystery that had no answers, like a puzzle with pieces that simply didn't fit. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept racing back to the attic, to the photo, and to the message written on that scrap of paper. I tried to think of any possible explanation, any forgotten event, any memory that could make sense of it all. But the harder I thought, the more fragmented it all became. It was as if my memories had been wiped away, erased, or worse, manipulated. The next morning, I went back to the attic, desperate for answers. I went through the box again, but there was nothing new. Just the same old photos, the same empty spaces in my mind. The photo, however, I kept with me. It felt like a constant reminder of the mystery that was slowly consuming me. Each day, the feeling that something was terribly wrong grew stronger. Who had taken that photo? Why was I in it? What did the message in the attic mean? These questions haunted me, and with each passing moment, I was less sure of the life I had once known. Something had changed, and now, the memories I had once trusted felt like fragile illusions. Story 7. The long drive to my parents' house had left me tired but eager. This was home, the house I'd grown up in, full of warmth and familiarity. Yet, as soon as I stepped inside, a strange weight seemed to settle over me. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I brushed it off as exhaustion, but a creeping unease settled deep in my stomach, refusing to be ignored. As I walked into the living room, something caught my eye. The family photos lining the walls, the same ones that had always been perfectly straight, were all tilted, just enough to feel wrong. My chest tightened as I stared at them. Reaching up to straighten one, I hesitated, a sudden chill racing down my arm. My hand hovered for a moment before I pulled it back. I tried to shake it off and headed to the kitchen, hoping to find comfort in the familiar smell of my mom's cooking. But as I passed through the hallway, the atmosphere seemed to shift again. The house felt alive, the silence too loud, pressing in on me. Even the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock sounded sharp, intrusive. The hallway stretched longer than I remembered, the dim light casting distorted shadows that made the space feel smaller, tighter. When I finally reached the kitchen, my mom was at the stove, stirring a pot. She turned and smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Her gaze was distant, her expression forced, like she wasn't fully there. I tried to convince myself she was just distracted, but the unease gnawed at me. As I set my bag down, I noticed something else. The cabinets were all slightly ajar, their doors cracked open just enough to seem deliberate. The drawers, too, were pulled out a fraction, like someone had gone through them in a hurry. I walked around, shutting each one carefully, my heart pounding with each soft click. "Mom, have you noticed anything strange?" I asked, my voice trembling. She looked at me, puzzled. "What do you mean?" I tried to explain, the tilted photos, the oppressive air, the cabinets, but she just smiled and said I must be tired. Her reassurance felt hollow, like she was saying it more for herself than for me. Dinner didn't help. The food tasted off. Not spoiled, but muted, like it had been stripped of its flavor. My dad sat across from me, silent and distant, barely touching his plate. His usual warmth and energy were gone, replaced by a faraway look in his eyes. After dinner, I wandered the house, trying to shake the growing sense of wrongness. Everywhere I looked, I noticed more things out of place. The rug in the living room was skewed, the chairs slightly moved, the entire house subtly rearranged in ways that felt unsettling. I made my way upstairs to my old bedroom, desperate for the comfort of familiarity. But when I opened the door, I was hit with a cold draft that didn't belong. The room looked the same at first glance, but the bed was too perfectly made, the pillows arranged differently than I'd left them. The books on my shelf were out of order, and the dresser drawers were all cracked open, just like the cabinets downstairs. My chest tightened as the realization hit me, someone, or something, had been here. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to steady my breathing, but the walls seemed to close in around me. The room felt foreign, like it no longer belonged to me. I stumbled back downstairs, needing to tell my parents. When I entered the living room, they were sitting in silence, staring at the TV. At first, I thought they were just engrossed in the show, but then I noticed their blank expressions. They weren't watching the screen. They weren't doing anything. "Mom? Dad?" I called, my voice shaking. They didn't respond. I stepped closer, shaking my dad's shoulder, but he didn't flinch. His eyes didn't even blink. My mom sat as still as a statue, her face void of emotion. A cold dread washed over me as the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Panicked, I bolted out the front door, gasping for air. The night was dark, the air outside just as heavy as it had been inside. I turned back to look at the house. The lights flickered erratically, casting strange, shifting shadows across the lawn. It felt alive. Watching me. I didn't know what was happening or why the house felt so wrong, but I knew one thing for certain, this wasn't home anymore. Whatever had taken root inside those walls had twisted it into something unrecognizable. I couldn't stay. Not with the suffocating weight of its presence pressing down on me. Not with the feeling of being watched, hunted. I backed away, my legs trembling, and ran to my car. As I drove off into the night, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The house stood there, silent and still, but I could swear I saw movement in one of the windows, a dark silhouette watching me leave. Whatever it was, it had taken my home. And I knew, deep down, it was never going to give it back. Story 8. I was sifting through old boxes in the attic when something caught my eye, a small, leather-bound album, buried beneath piles of forgotten trinkets and dust-covered keepsakes. I had no memory of it being there, but curiosity gnawed at me. I gently pulled it out, brushing away the years of grime, and opened the cover. Inside were faded photographs from my childhood, family gatherings, birthdays, vacations. But one photo in particular drew me in, and as my gaze landed on it, a cold shiver slithered down my spine. It was a picture of my childhood home, the house I hadn't seen in years. Yet, something was terribly wrong with it. The angle was unfamiliar, and the house seemed different. The windows were tightly shut, the garden wildly overgrown, and the paint on the walls peeled away in a way I didn't remember. But what unsettled me the most was the stark truth behind the photograph: it was taken after the house had been sold. I knew this for a fact because I had been there the day the new owners took possession. No one had set foot inside since then. How could this photo exist? I stared at it, my mind spiraling with questions. I'd never seen the house in such a state, not after it had been abandoned. It had stood empty for years after the sale, slowly deteriorating into nothing more than a shell of what it once was. But this picture, it suggested otherwise. A disturbing déjà vu gripped me, as if I had already witnessed the house in this exact condition, yet I knew that I hadn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to see it for myself. I needed answers. The drive was long, quiet, and the closer I got, the more unease settled in my stomach. When I finally turned onto the street where my old home stood, I saw it in the distance. It was still there, tall and quiet, just as I remembered. But something wasn't right. The house looked exactly like the photograph, overgrown, neglected, and shrouded in an eerie darkness. It didn't look like anyone had lived there for years. I parked my car, the tires crunching on the gravel, and stepped out. The front gate creaked in the wind as I walked toward it, the garden as wild and untamed as it appeared in the photo. I reached the front door, it was slightly ajar. There was no reason for it to be open. No one had lived here in years. I pushed it open cautiously, the hinges groaning with an almost mournful sound. Stepping inside, the silence was suffocating, thick with the stench of dust and decay. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I walked, the air heavy, as if the house were holding its breath. Everything was exactly as I remembered, yet it wasn't. The furniture was gone, the walls bare, but there was something in the atmosphere that felt off. The house hummed with an unsettling energy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My heart pounded in my chest, urging me to leave, but my legs refused to listen. I moved deeper into the house, drawn to the familiar hallway leading to the bedrooms. The walls, once brightly decorated with playful wallpaper, were now peeling, their colors faded. I stopped in front of the door to my old room. It was closed, but it felt like it was calling me. I reached out and slowly opened it, my breath catching in my throat. Inside, it was exactly as I remembered, except it wasn't. The room was empty, save for a small wooden chair sitting in the center of the floor. The air here felt thicker, heavier, as though the memories of the past were pressing in on me from every side. I could almost hear the whispers of long-forgotten moments. I stepped inside, my feet sinking into the dust-covered carpet. It felt wrong, like I was intruding on something that no longer belonged to me. Something had changed in this house. Something I couldn't quite grasp. I moved toward the window and pulled back the curtains, hoping for some fresh air. Outside, everything looked as it should, my old backyard, the swing set, the tree where I'd spent so many afternoons playing. But then, my blood ran cold. There, standing at the edge of the yard, was a figure. A shadow. Too far away to make out any details, but I knew someone was there. Someone was watching me. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Panicked, I rushed out of the room and through the hallway, toward the front door. Just as my hand reached for the handle, I heard a faint creak behind me, like the floorboards were shifting. I spun around, but there was nothing. Empty space. My pulse raced, and I didn't waste another second. I bolted for the door, slamming it shut behind me. I didn't stop until I was in my car, hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. My mind raced with confusion, fear, and disbelief. That house, it was always strange, always had an eerie atmosphere. But this? This was something else. How could that photograph exist, showing the house in its derelict state when no one had been inside for years? How could it look exactly like the house I had just left, down to the smallest detail? I had no answers. All I knew was that something was wrong with that house, something that defied explanation, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was still there. Waiting.